Mystery stories and detective fiction. What does that make you think of? What are the first things that come to mind when I say mystery stories?
Sherlock Holmes.
Sherlock Holmes. Victor, what were you going to say?
Thrillers.
Thrillers, right. Now, as we've discussed, thrillers are also, the main thing about a thriller is the suspense. You know, it's exciting. You don't know what's going to happen next. And yes, they definitely have something in common with thrillers. However, the key part of a detective story or a mystery story is not the excitement, not even the anticipation, it's the mystery. So what's a mystery?
It's something that needs to be explained.
Exactly right. It's something that needs to be explained, a problem that needs to be solved. Mm-hmm. And the detective is the person who does it. You see, in order for it to be a mystery story or for it to be a detective story, someone's got to be the detective, and there's got to be the unknown problem to solve. It's not just something we don't know, it's something we need to find out. Now, in a normal book, there's always something you don't know, which is what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen next. But in a mystery story, it's not just what's going to happen that's a mystery. It's that there is something that has already happened that we don't know. And what's interesting about a mystery story is it's usually the story of the investigation. So imagine that the investigation starts and it moves forward in time like that, right? But before the beginning of the investigation, something has happened in the past, a crime, right? And as this story moves forward, we also learn bits and pieces of the backstory, you know, the hidden story, which is the story of the crime. Now, there have always been mysteries that need to be solved in fiction. You know, you can even go back so far as Greek mythology, and you could talk about the story of Oedipus. Does anybody know that story? Andrea, do you know the story of Oedipus?
Oedip?
Yes.
Yes.
So what's the mystery in that story?
His father, he doesn't know his father, and he will kill him, and he doesn't know his mother, and he will marry her, and
exactly.
And that's it.
Exactly. So what happens is there's a prophecy at the start, right, which tells us what's going to happen. And this is interesting. There's a prediction. It tells us what's going to happen. And we think it's impossible, but it's fate and it's going to happen. And so what's interesting about that is that the reader of the story, in a sense, knows the ending, but Oedipus doesn't. And in the story, remember, the way he becomes a hero is that he solves the riddle of the Sphinx, the enigma. The Sphinx poses a question, he finds the answer, and therefore he cures the plague that has come to Thebes. And therefore, he is rewarded with the hand in marriage of the queen, whose husband was recently killed by a stranger on the road, who was Oedipus. But of course, what we find out is they are his real parents, and they abandoned him as a child because of the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. And therefore, he solves the mystery of the Sphinx. But then he also has to do this kind of quest for his own origins. He has to find out who he is. And when he finds out, he realizes that he has committed the horrible crimes of patricide and incest. And therefore, he plucks out his own eyes, the eyes that saw the mystery, the secret. You can look at other narrative forms up through the ages. For example, in the medieval romance, there is also an element of mystery, of solving a problem. For example, Gawain and the Green Knight. Gawain has to go searching for the knight to find out who he is. in order to prevent his own murder, because the knight has promised to come back a year from that day and chop off his head. And if he doesn't find out who the knight is before that happens, then he's going to get chopped. So another one, which is kind of an interesting example as well, is Hamlet. Do you guys know the story of Hamlet? Adriana, for example, do you know Shakespeare's Hamlet?
No.
Okay. What about Zineb? Do you know the story of Hamlet?
No, I don't.
Okay. Anyone? Marine?
No.
Okay. So in Hamlet, at the very beginning, Hamlet's father has been killed. Now, it's kind of weird as well in this one, because the beginning of the play, he gets visited by the ghost of his father, who tells him who killed him. It's his uncle Claudius, and he has to not find out who did it, but he has to get the murderer to reveal himself. And what's interesting about that also is that he's there's that kind of Oedipal, Oedipien theme, because Claudius is his uncle, and he has killed his father to take his place as king and as the husband of Hamlet's mother, the queen. And so Hamlet needs to kill the father figure in order to have his mother all to himself again. You know, so there's that kind of Oedipal complex going on in that story too. Now, if you look at the image that I chose to share, it's a famous scene in the play where Hamlet is talking to his friend Horatio, and they're talking to a gravedigger. And it's the one, you must have seen this image, you know, of Hamlet holding up the skull. You know, that's the famous scene. He holds up the skull and he says, "Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio." He knows the person who is dead, and he talks about him. But what's interesting to me also is the fact that they are digging up human remains, and that they are examining bones, and that they are talking about the person who has died, which is a little bit like a crime scene investigation or digging up the past, you know, to examine the corpse, to examine the evidence. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting echo as well. You may be pleased to know that the detective is a French invention. The very first detective, in a way, was Vidocq, Eugène François Vidocq. And he was, has anyone heard of him? There's a book called Les Mémoires de Vidocq, which was hugely successful, which was his autobiography. And he was a master criminal, in fact. And at one point, they persuaded him to become a spy in prison, telling them what the other prisoners were planning. And in return, they faked his escape and let him go free. And then he became a detective, and he was involved in setting up the Bureau des Renseignements Universels, which is a bit like the Renseignements Généraux now. It was a detective agency, but he was also involved in official police business as a detective. And he invented many of the techniques of criminology that are still used today. So he inspired Edgar Allan Poe, who I believe you've been reading. You guys have read some Poe? So one of the stories that you might not have read, I think, is The Murders on the Rue Morgue. Has anyone read that one? No? Okay. So in this story, Edgar Allan Poe basically invents detective fiction, because unlike Vidocq, who is a criminal and a kind of poacher turned gamekeeper, we might say. You know, what's the word in French for a poacher? It's braconnier. Donc, le braconnier qui devient garde-chasse. It's the, he's switched sides, right? Whereas Claude Auguste Dupin is the Chevalier Dupin. He's a gentleman. He's an amateur. He's not a policeman, but he helps the police. And he's very thoughtful, depressed, intellectual, refined, all of that kind of thing. you know, the classic detective, right? And he calls his technique ratiocination, which is like using the rational, using your reason to find out who the murderer was or whatever. And in the Murders in the Rue Morgue, it's got the classic locked room problem, which is the idea where there's a horrible murder that has taken place, a double murder, inside a room, but it's all locked from the inside. Windows and doors are all locked. So how did the murderer get in and how did the murderer get back out? And I recommend reading it. It's highly entertaining, and the identity of the murderer is completely surprising and ridiculous, but it's great. So this, interestingly though, is before the word detective was even coined. It had not been invented. I guess they would say investigator, right? About 30 years later, Wilkie Collins wrote The Moonstone, which is considered to be one of the finest detective novels in English. But what's really interesting is that in The Moonstone, Sergeant Cuff, who is the detective, he does not solve the crime. In fact, the crime is solved by a doctor who is kind of a slightly mystical character, and he solves it using a very strange reconstruction of the crime. The Woman in White is another one in which mysteries are solved. They were referred to at the time as sensation novels because they were sensational and thrilling. Now, historically, detectives kind of began in America with the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Anyone heard of the Pinkertons? They were like, they were private detectives. They worked for clients. They weren't police. But what was interesting about them is that because there wasn't really a proper police force at this point in America. In France, there was. In Paris, there has been some kind of police since the 16th century. I think that is one of the oldest police forces that still exists. But the Pinkertons were like kind of hired thugs. Like they would also, mess with people's business, but they investigated crimes. And they were also able to operate outside the actual United States because, as you know, in the 19th century, the West of America was not yet incorporated as states. So you had the frontier and then the Wild West, where there was no law, except sheriffs, for example, who were hired by the town to be a sheriff. Like it was a job. They weren't state police in any way. They weren't paid by the state because there were no states. And in England, there was the Bow Street Runners, who were a kind of slightly less formal police force, and they gave rise to the famous Scotland Yard. So the word itself, detective, this is why this is the person, right, who solves the mystery, because it comes from tegere in Latin, which means to cover. So detegere means to uncover, to unveil or reveal that which is hidden. And it's an interesting image because, it's not just somebody who solves a problem. It's somebody who lifts the lid, who opens the box. And I think it's really interesting because often detective stories are not just about a crime, not just about a murder, but they also uncover corruption and transgression in society. They uncover really dark things that are going on behind closed doors, that kind of thing. And it's interesting because, detective, you've got a police detective, but then you've also got the private investigator who works for clients, which is sometimes shortened to PI or private eye, like eye. And the Pinkerton slogan is the all-seeing eye, or I think I might have got that wrong. I think it might be the eye that never sleeps. But in any case, it's kind of scary. And you could link that, and this is what the illustration is of, to the demon prince Asmodee, who in the kind of mythology around that figure, he is supposed to have been this kind of figure who could see everything. And sometimes he's depicted as in this picture here that you can see, flying over the rooftops or standing on a rooftop and looking out over the city. And he was supposed to lift the roofs of houses to look inside at what was going on in secret. And there's a fabulous passage in a Sherlock Holmes novel where they're traveling through the countryside by train, and he says, imagine if we could lift the roofs of all these houses, what terrible secrets we would find. So it's interesting because the rise of mystery fiction, detective fiction, also comes with the Industrial Revolution and with urbanization, with the fact that more and more people lived in cities, they lived in close quarters, but they were surrounded by strangers. You know, in a village, you know everyone, right? And people know what's going on in each other's houses, basically. But in the city, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. And so Asmodeus is the one who lifts the lid, who lifts the roof, and the detective is the one who lifts the roof. I think you can see an echo of that word, of the tegere, the cover, in like architect, you know, is the one who makes the roof. And in, I wonder if it's linked to tectonic as well, as in tectonic plates. They're the things that cover the earth, right? So to detect is to lift, is to raise the roof. Now, of course, Sherlock Holmes. Have any of you read any Sherlock Holmes stories or novels? Nobody? You might have seen a TV version or a film version. There have been many. He's one of the most filmed characters, if not, I think he actually might be the most filmed character in history. There was a really good series a few years ago by the BBC with Benedict Cumberbatch. Has anyone seen that one? Called Sherlock. Really, really good. It's a modern adaptation. And he was invented by Arthur Conan Doyle in the 1880s. And all of his stories were told by Dr. Watson, who's kind of a very, very intelligent, ordinary man. He's a qualified doctor. He's basically retired and lives a life of ease with his friend Sherlock Holmes. Now, what's interesting is we get the story from Dr. Watson's perspective. Why do you think that would be a good idea? In terms of the narrative, like why would it make sense? Zineb, what do you think?
I don't know. We will have more details because he will be able to see, like not only the action of the people outside of how can I explain this? Not only the action of the other characters, but also the actions of Sherlock Holmes.
Right, right. And exactly, he describes to us what Sherlock Holmes does. And that's important because he's like the stand-in for the reader. He's like the ordinary person, right? Whereas Sherlock Holmes is kind of like a super genius. So Watson shows us what Holmes is doing, but it's mysterious to us. Like we don't know why he's doing it. It's like we don't know how he figures stuff out. And Watson is always really impressed by and kind of annoyed by how Holmes figures stuff out. So he stands in for the reader, and it allows us to be impressed, and it allows us to not to have the story short-circuited. Like if Holmes was telling the story, he would make these leaps in logic that we wouldn't be able to follow. Whereas he has to explain it to Watson. You know, Watson says, "Oh, that was brilliant, Holmes. How did you do it?" And then Holmes explains. So he's a brilliant plot device. But what's interesting as well is that Sherlock Holmes as a character, he's always going on about how he is like a scientist. He says that what he does is the science of deduction. And what's interesting about that is that it is neither scientific nor is it deduction. In fact, he draws from many other figures rather than just the scientist. For example, if we look at the picture you can see there, that's the classic representation of Sherlock Holmes. In his hand, what's he got? What's he holding up? Does anyone know the word in English for une loupe? It's a magnifying glass, right? So it's that, round glass, which people use for examining things closely. Some people use them for reading, or they used to. So that's interesting because it's for close examination. It makes sense. It's almost like the precursor to a microscope, which is scientific, right? To look at something really closely, to examine the details, and it's the classic symbol now of the detective, as you can see in the PowerPoint, like the footprints and the magnifying glass. But actually, there's something a little bit sort of clairvoyant about it too, because it allows you to see further and it allows you to see things you couldn't normally see. It's a little bit like a crystal ball. But in his other hand, he has a meerschaum pipe, a very large pipe. Now, he's very much associated with the pipe as well, but why? Why do you think a pipe would be a good thing for a detective to have? I mean, you might think I'm being facetious, but in fact, smoking is really important in the stories because, for example, he uses the pipe as a way of meditating. Like he sits and smokes his pipe and thinks, and he refers to something at one point as a 3-pipe problem, which means, he's going to smoke his pipe full of tobacco 3 times over while he thinks, because it's a real problem. But also the way it portrays him in the novels, smoking, sometimes it says he sits on a cushion on the ground, on a kind of a silk cushion, embroidered, and he smokes the pipe and he has clouds of blue smoke around him. And that gives him kind of almost like an Orientalist, meaning sort of cliches about the East, kind of an Oriental mysticism, like, you might think of an Indian yogi sitting cross-legged on the floor, or you might think of the Arabic practice of smoking hookah, or you might think of the practice of smoking hashish in order to have sort of, to change one's thinking or to have visionary experiences even. It also makes us think perhaps of opium, which is part of some of the novels, some of the stories. There's even one where he disguises himself and he visits an opium den, which was a feature of London at the time. And this is, around the time of the Opium Wars in China. And so all of those things kind of attribute to him some of the mystique of the Eastern mystic or the Eastern sorcerer. But also he's got the hat, right? He's got the hat, which is called a deer stalker, which means that you use it for hunting deer. And I was just thinking about this last week when I was preparing for this class, and it suddenly occurred to me why the deer stalker has a brim on the front and a brim on the back and nothing at the sides. Why do you think it would be? So if you remember, it's made in England, made in Britain. So the brim in the front, I think, is to protect your eyes from the rain, maybe the sun, but mostly the rain. The one on the back is to stop the rain going down your neck. But the reason there's nothing at the sides is so that your peripheral vision remains active, so you can see things moving, so that the brim doesn't get in the way. So he's also a hunter. But in some ways, he's also associated with being very artistic. He plays the violin incredibly badly. He writes academic books. He's like a researcher as well. And he also has something about, there's something about intoxication. I mean, the smoking is important also just because he uses it to gather evidence. There's one story where there's somebody coming into a locked room and stealing stuff. And in order to find out, he spends 3 days pacing around the room constantly, smoking constantly, and he's smoking cigarettes. And he spreads so much cigarette ash on the floor that the next night when the person breaks in, they leave footprints in the ash. So smoking as a way of evidence gathering. but also he's presented as a drug addict. In fact, he's addicted to cocaine and morphine, and he injects cocaine. And at one point, Dr. Watson has to help him to break his addiction to cocaine. And he does that because he's bored, because his brain is so powerful that if he doesn't have a problem to solve, then he needs distraction. But he also uses opium, morphine, cocaine as ways to change his mind. They're psychotropic drugs to change his consciousness. And therefore, there is also a kind of a link with the magical or the occult. He's got a kind of a magician kind of aspect to him. Like, he can change his appearance. Now, he does it through makeup, disguise, but also he's supposed to be able to completely change his body language and even his height and his size and his movements, so that he becomes a different person. So he's like transforming into a different person. And he has some of that mystique of the sort of the wizard. But the other thing, which is really important, is that he's also like a doctor, because, you know, Arthur Conan Doyle himself trained as a doctor, and he never had any patients, so he wasn't possibly a very good doctor. But he was inspired by Joseph Bell, who was an Edinburgh doctor who trained him. And Joseph Bell was supposed to have had this ability to diagnose illnesses through observation of very small clues. And in a way, Sherlock Holmes, you know, you go to consult him. He's a consulting detective. His colleague is Dr. Watson. You tell him your problem, and he looks at you and looks at clues, symptoms, and from them he diagnoses what your disease is, or the cause of the crime. So he's also diagnosing disease in society, corruption, malice, murder, hate, all of those things. And there's a sense in which he is an expert in diagnosis. And what he's doing, really, there's always a scene at the beginning where his client comes in and he just looks at them, and then he tells them who they are. He tells the person all about themselves, just from his observations. And he's using a technique that we would call cold reading, which is what psychics do. They basically look at a person and try to take in as much detail as possible about their physical appearance, their dress, about any little signs and hints and clues. And when they talk, they listen really closely, and then they can tell them things that seem supernatural, but they're actually not. They're just reading the person's appearance and manners and talk. And so he does that. And in a sense, he also resembles perhaps a psychoanalyst, you know, because he's also interpreting symbols that people tell him. He's listening to their story and he's interpreting the symbols. So he's the great detective. However, he may not have been the most successful writer of mystery stories ever. This is a tweet that I saw last week and I thought it was hilarious. Arthur Conan Doyle says, "I have invented the greatest detective of all time." And Agatha Christie says, "Hold my tea." And then he says, "Why does this tea taste funny?" Now, do you know the sort of the meme phrase, "Hold my beer"? Right, so Victor, what does it mean?
It means watch me do it.
Right, exactly. And it's got a sort of a bravado, an insouciance, because it's like you're just sitting there drinking a beer and somebody does something and you're like, "Oh, I can do better than that. Hey, hold my beer while I show you," you know? But of course she would say, "Hold my tea," because she's a refined English lady. But why does Doyle say, "Why does this tea taste funny?" Because it's poisoned. Because the tea is poisoned. Because in Agatha Christie novels, there is often somebody who gets murdered by poison. Now, I couldn't find the response, but it was so amazing. Somebody responded to this tweet by saying, did you know that Agatha Christie was an expert in poisons, not because she did research as a novelist into poisons, but because she was trained in toxicology. She was actually an expert scientist in toxicology. And so she didn't learn about poisons because she was a mystery writer. She became a mystery writer because she knew about poisons, which I think is an absolutely brilliant fact. So does anyone know what Agatha Christie's great detectives were called? Because she actually invented two of the greatest detectives of all time. You may have seen the TV shows about them. So one of them is another French detective, or rather Belgian, Hercule Poirot, right? And he is almost like a comedy Frenchman. I mean, again, he's Belgian, but he has, he's very, very fussy, and he's very well dressed. He's a dandy, and he has a beautiful waxed mustache. And he's always worried about getting his clothes dirty, and he likes good food and good wine and everything. And he speaks with an outrageous comedy French accent. But it's interesting because perhaps he is a callback to the fact that detectives were invented in France. And he's also, interestingly, Sherlock Holmes is revealed at one point to have ancestors who are French. So there's something particularly French about this type of story. The other one, of course, is Miss Marple, who is a very genteel old lady, totally unthreatening. And, I sometimes wonder, how is it that every time Miss Marple gets invited to a country house, somebody ends up getting murdered? Maybe there's a pattern there. You start to wonder if maybe she was the one committing the murders. Of course, she's not, but it's true that there have been murder mystery stories in which the narrator of the story is revealed to be the murderer, or in which the person who was murdered, it turns out they are also the murderer, that they committed suicide and made it look like murder. Or, the person who, the detective turns out to be the murderer. Like, there's all these ways of kind of playing with it. Around the same time, this is kind of, 1920s to 1940s, in America, you have the development of hard-boiled fiction. And it means hard-boiled as in eggs. Like, I think the French expression would be dur à cuire, les œufs durs, but it means like tough. And this is, I think if you look at the image that you can, if you look at the image you can see on the screen there, this is the classic iconography that we're familiar with from film noir. It's the lone detective who is almost always not a policeman. He's a private detective. He wears the fedora and the trench coat. He's usually somebody who is like damaged, failure, loser, outcast. You imagine him having a bottle of whiskey and a gun in his desk drawer. And you often have the client coming in, who often is, as you see in the picture, right, the femme fatale. And sometimes the femme fatale is the victim of the murder. Sometimes she's the murderer, and sometimes she's the client. And sometimes she might be two of the three, or, and these stories often have a very kind of ironic, cynical tone, very dark, like, the crime is just the tip of the iceberg. He's hired to investigate a disappearance, and then he finds out that the person has been murdered. And then he finds out that they're part of a criminal conspiracy. There's a kind of a spreading stain of corruption. And the image that we keep of these novels is the one from a line by Raymond Chandler. He's the one who wrote the Philip Marlowe novels. And the line is, down these mean streets a man must go, though he is not himself mean. So he's like the one good guy, even though he knows how to be tough, how to be a bad guy. But it's full of the detectives getting beaten up and failing. Sometimes they don't even succeed in solving the crime. And when those books were filmed in the 1940s and onwards, well, 30s, especially in the 40s though, after World War II, when the French critics at the Cahiers du Cinéma saw the films, which in America at the time were called crime melodrama, or gangster movies, or whatever it was, the critic Nino Frank said, "Les Américains font aussi des films noirs," because he was referring to the color coding on the series of books. Like, there was the Bibliothèque Rose and the Bibliothèque Bleue and the Bibliothèque Vert. And the série noire was dark, gothic, and detective fiction. So when he said film noir, he meant they're like those books, and now they're making films of them. And when the Americans heard the term, they thought, ooh, that sounds cool. That's what we should call these films. And so the genre of film noir was born. As in so many other cases, the Americans did something cool, and then the French told them what to think about it. France has often provided the intellectual scaffolding for the cultural products of the Anglophone world. Then, of course, you guys might remember from when you were kids, Le Club des Cinq. Did anybody read them? That was the famous five, written by Enid Blyton. So the British ones were famous five, Secret Seven, and in America they had Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. And I find this very interesting, this idea that you can see a version of it in a kind of a satirical version in Scooby-Doo, where it's a group of young people who solve mysteries, right? And inevitably at the end of it, there is the scene where the villain is unmasked. Someone's been pretending to be a monster, and they take off the mask and they go, "Oh, it's Old Man Withers from the fairground." And he says, "Ah, I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids," right? But it intrigues me to think, what message does this send to children who read them, right? It says, don't trust adults. They might be a monster in disguise. And it says, children see things more clearly. And it says, don't trust adults because they either don't know what's going on, don't understand what's going on, or they are what's going on. Instead, surround yourself with a gang of kids. That's who you can trust. And I find that a very interesting message. You don't have to read them that way, but I think it's an interesting message for children's fiction to give. Another thing that's happened more recently is a rise in historical fiction, because there's two things going on. As technology changes, mobile phones, security cameras, being able to Google stuff instead of, for example, you often have that scene in detective stories where they're in a library looking at local newspapers on microfilm, whereas often now you can search the archives from anywhere on your phone, digitized archives. So what goes hand in hand with that is a lot of new detective stories that are set in the past. A great example being Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, pictured there, the film, Sean Connery. And he's a monk, because a monk is a great candidate to be a detective because he's educated. He knows how to look into things. And because of his status as a religious person, he can move between different parts of society, and he can go into places. He can go into homes, into private homes, and be invited. And also because he has the resources of the church, both intellectual, spiritual, and economic. And he has the he has the support, in a sense, of that body. And the church itself has investigators who investigate things like miracles or sainthoods, or who practice exorcisms, things like that. People have imagined many other historical characters as detectives. You know, Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe have been put as protagonists in detective stories. There's even, I think, a novel series which has Jane Austen as a detective, which I think is an excellent concept. And then the final thing I wanted to just point out in finishing is, you know, there's a huge amount of TV and film material which is based on the detective story. And it's got a lot of different subgenres, like there's the police procedural, you know, where it's all about how police solve crimes. You've got the forensic science, you know, Les Experts, CSI. And what's interesting about these, and this is, you know, I talked about it for the essay, is how self-referential they are. Often they're very much aware of the conventions of the genre, and they play with them, subvert them, reference them. And shown here, pictured, is a very good example, which is a series from the 2000s called Veronica Mars, which is about, it's kind of a high school drama, except the girl in high school is also a private detective. So well worth watching. I recommend it, and happens to be written by a friend of mine. Anyway, thank you all for coming, les fidèles, and I will see you next week. I believe we have one more week on Zoom next week, and then we have one more week présentiel in the final week. So for the final week, please do try to make it to that last class. Okay? Any questions?
Yes, for the essay, we have to answer what question?
It's I put it on the
Okay.
I will make sure and send it again if I haven't. Okay, and I'm going to extend the deadline to next week, so there's no panic.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.